Ezekiel Covington rode into Laredo, Texas on a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1878 with $43 in his pocket, a deed to 80 acres of good grazing land tucked into his breast pocket, a saddle horse named Duchess beneath him, and the particular kind of confidence that gets a man into serious trouble before the night is done. He had been working that land for 3 years, building it from raw scrub brush into something that resembled a real operation. 3 years of mending fences in the August heat, of riding out at 4 in the morning to check on a heifer struggling through a difficult birth, of eating beans so many consecutive nights that he had nearly forgotten what fresh bread tasted like. 3 years of hard labor had produced a small but respectable cattle outfit, and with the cattle sold at market just that afternoon, Ezekiel had money in his pocket and a feeling in his chest that most men who work the land only feel 2 or 3 times in a lifetime. The feeling that everything is finally going according to plan. He should have ridden straight back to his ranch. He would tell himself this many times in the weeks that followed, turning the memory over and over like a stone he could not put down. He should have bought himself a good meal, tipped his hat to the barkeep, and pointed Duchess back toward home under the rising moon. He should have done a great many things differently on that particular Tuesday evening in Laredo. Instead, he tied Duchess to the hitching post outside the Broken Spur Saloon, pushed through the swinging doors with the easy stride of a man who belonged exactly where he was going, and sat down at a card table with 3 strangers, and the particular kind of ambition that ruins men. The game was poker, which Ezekiel played well enough on a good night. That night was not a good night for his cards, though the whiskey was fine, and the company was agreeable enough in that surface way that strangers in saloons often are. There was a man named Daltrey who wore a pearl-handled revolver and smiled too readily. A man named Webb who barely spoke and watched everything with flat gray eyes, and a traveling merchant from San Antonio who sweated through his collar and consistently bet with more enthusiasm than the quality of his hand warranted. For the first hour, the cards went evenly enough, and Ezekiel found himself up a few dollars and feeling invincible in the way that a few small wins and several whiskeys can make a man feel invincible. He told himself he had a feel for the game. He told himself he could read Daltrey's tells. He told himself this was practically free money. By midnight, the merchant from San Antonio had excused himself with slumped shoulders and considerably lighter pockets. Ezekiel had lost back everything he had won and then some, but he was in the grip of a certainty that his luck was about to turn. It always turned. He had seen it happen. He pushed the $43 from his cattle sale into the center of the table and felt entirely sure he was about to double it. He lost the $43 in 2 hands. He took the deed from his breast pocket and studied it for a long moment. The paper was soft from being folded and unfolded so many times, and the ink had faded slightly at the creases, but the words were still legible. 80 acres, registered in the name of Ezekiel James Covington, Frio County, Texas. 3 years of his life was written in those faded ink letters, and he placed the deed at the center of the table with the steady hands of a man who has convinced himself that the next hand will surely be the one that turns it all around. He lost the deed in a single hand, and Daltrey folded it into his coat pocket without ceremony, the way a man pockets a bill of sale for a piece of livestock. Ezekiel sat very still for a moment. The saloon noise carried on around him. The clink of glasses, the rough music of a piano missing 2 keys, the laughter of men who were still winning or who had already lost enough that the losing no longer mattered. He felt the particular emptiness of a man who has in the space of one evening dismantled 3 years of his own life's work. He had no money. He had no land. He had the clothes on his back, his saddle, his rifle in its scabbard and Duchess. He pushed back from the table without a word because there was nothing adequate to say. He collected his hat from the chair beside him and walked through the saloon and out into the night air, which was cool and smelled of horses and dust and the distant sweetness of blooming mesquite. He untied Duchess from the hitching post and stood beside her for a long moment, his forehead resting against her warm neck, feeling her breathe. "Well," he said quietly to himself and to the horse both, "I expect we have had better evenings than this one." Duchess turned her head and regarded him with one large dark eye, and he could have sworn she looked disappointed. He swung up into the saddle and pointed her north, because north was where his empty ranch waited, and because a man who has just lost everything he owns still has to sleep somewhere, even if that somewhere no longer belongs to him. The road out of Laredo was pale under the moon, and the mesquite scrub on either side rustled softly in the night breeze. Ezekiel rode without hurrying, because there was no longer anything to hurry toward. His mind was very quiet in the way that minds sometimes go quiet after a catastrophic blow, as though the full weight of it has not yet arrived. He had ridden perhaps 4 miles out of town, following the pale road north, when he saw the wagon. It was stopped at an angle across the road, one rear wheel sitting at a bad tilt that told the whole story at a glance. The wheel had thrown a spoke, or the axle had cracked, and the wagon was going nowhere under its own power until someone fixed what was broken. A single horse stood in the harness, a long-legged roan mare who turned her head toward Duchess with the mild interest of horses everywhere. A lantern hung from the wagon's iron bracket, casting a small amber circle of light, and within that circle stood a woman who was attempting to assess the damage with the calm, methodical attention of someone who has dealt with broken things before and intends to deal with this one too. Ezekiel pulled Duchess up at a respectful distance. "Evening," he said. "Looks like you've got some trouble there." The woman looked up at him without flinching. She was perhaps 24 or 25 years old, with dark hair pinned up under a practical hat, and she had the sort of face that was striking not because of any single feature, but because of the way all the features worked together. The directness of dark eyes, the determined line of her jaw, the mouth that seemed always on the verge of some considered opinion. She wore a plain traveling dress of dark blue cotton that was dusty at the hem from the road, and she held the lantern up slightly to get a better look at him. "The axle," she said, with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who has already diagnosed the problem and is now evaluating her options. "It cracked through. I've been trying to assess whether there's a way to brace it enough to make it to the next homestead, but I don't think there is." Ezekiel dismounted and walked Duchess to the wagon's front wheel, looping her reins over the wagon rail. He crouched down to look at the axle in the lantern light, and she crouched beside him, holding the lantern steady. She was right. The axle had cracked clean through about 6 inches from the hub, and the crack ran at an angle that meant any weight on it would snap it the rest of the way. "You can't drive on that," he said. "Not even a mile. You'd lose the wheel entirely and tip the whole thing." "That was my assessment as well," she said. "I was hoping I was wrong." He straightened up and she straightened beside him, and for a moment they both looked at the broken axle in the lamplight as though it might volunteer a solution. "Is there someone expecting you?" he asked. "Somewhere close?" "I'm going to the Langley homestead," she said. "It's about 12 miles north of here, my aunt's place. I came from San Antonio by stage to Laredo and hired this wagon for the last stretch, but the driver took ill before we left town and I told him I could manage the road myself." She paused. "I have managed roads myself before. This particular road was not cooperative." "No, ma'am," he agreed. "Roads rarely are." He studied the situation for a moment. The wagon contained several trunks and a crate of what looked like household goods, which was too much weight to transport any other way tonight. Duchess was a good strong horse, but she wasn't a draft animal, and even empty the wagon would be too unstable to pull on a cracked axle. "My name is Ezekiel Covington," he said. "I'm headed north, same direction you're going. My place is—" He stopped himself, because he did not currently have a place, not really. "I know this road. I can ride with you to wherever you can get shelter for the night, and in the morning we can arrange to get the wagon repaired. If there's a homestead closer than 12 miles, we should try there first." She looked at him steadily for a moment, making the kind of assessment that a woman traveling alone at night has to make about strangers who offer help. He stood still and let her look, because he understood what she was doing and thought it was sensible. "Eliza Langley," she said, and extended her hand, which was a more straightforward greeting than many men gave each other. "There's a homestead about 3 miles north. The Baxter family. I met Mrs. Baxter when I passed through this way 2 years ago. She's a decent woman." "Then that's where we'll go," Ezekiel said. "Can you ride?" She gave him a look that communicated very clearly that she found the question slightly insulting. "I grew up on a ranch in New Mexico Territory," she said. "I have been riding since before I could read." "Then take Duchess," he said. "I'll lead the roan from the wagon harness. She's calmer than your horse and we won't go fast." Eliza Langley looked at Duchess with the appraising eye of someone who knew horses, and Duchess, who was a sociable animal, stretched her nose forward to be inspected. Something in Eliza's expression shifted slightly, not softened exactly, but relaxed in the way that a person's face relaxes when they recognize something they trust. "All right," she said. They unhitched the roan mare from the wagon. Her name was Belle, according to the hired wagon's paperwork still folded under the seat, which Eliza tucked into her bag, and Eliza swung up onto Duchess with the easy economy of movement that comes from a genuine lifetime of riding. Ezekiel led Belle and they moved north together along the pale road with the moon over their right shoulders and the night sounds of South Texas surrounding them. "What brings you out from San Antonio?" he asked after they had ridden in silence long enough that conversation felt natural. "My Aunt Margaret is unwell," Eliza said. "She wrote to me 3 weeks ago. She has been managing the homestead alone since my uncle died last fall, and she needs someone to help her through the summer at minimum. I came as quickly as I could arrange it." "I'm sorry about your uncle," he said. "He was a good man," she said simply. "Stubborn as a post and had terrible opinions about coffee, but a good man." Ezekiel felt a smile pull at the corner of his mouth, the first of the evening. What was wrong with his opinions about coffee? "He believed it should be thin enough to read a newspaper through," she said, with the conviction of someone who had strong feelings on the subject. "That is not coffee. That is hot brown water with aspirations." He laughed, and it came out genuine and slightly surprised because he had not expected to be laughing tonight of all nights. "I'm inclined to agree with you," he said. She glanced over at him, and he thought he caught the edge of a smile in the moonlight before she looked back at the road. "You're coming from Laredo at this hour," she said. "Long way from home for a Tuesday night." "I had business in town," he said. "It did not go as well as I hoped." "Business," she repeated, with a gentleness that somehow did not feel like prying. "Cards," he said, and the word came out flat and honest. There was something about the dark road and the quiet night and this stranger beside him on his own horse that made dishonesty feel like more effort than it was worth. "I played cards and I lost things I should not have wagered." She was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" "I lost my land," he said. 80 acres in Frio County, and the money from this year's cattle sale before it." He paused. "I still have the horse you're sitting on, which is a mercy, and the clothes I'm wearing and my rifle and saddle." That is the full accounting. He expected judgment, or perhaps the careful non-response of someone who does not want to get involved in another person's disasters. What he got instead was a long, quiet moment followed by, "That is a very thorough loss for one evening." "It is," he agreed. "What will you do?" she asked, and the question was direct but not cruel, more like a practical inquiry, the kind of question someone asks when they're genuinely trying to understand the scope of a problem. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "Tonight I'm going to sleep somewhere and figure it out in the morning when I'm not still in the first shock of it." He paused. "I expect there are ranches looking for good hands. I know cattle work. I can break horses. I'll find something." She nodded slowly as though weighing this. "You don't sound like a man who makes a habit of gambling away his livelihood," she said. "I don't," he said. "First time I've done anything of the kind. Probably a poor night to start." He paused again. "Definitely a poor night to start." "The worst nights usually are," she said. "The ones you didn't expect." They rode in comfortable silence for a while after that, which surprised him, how comfortable it was, given that they were strangers and it was past midnight on a moonlit road in South Texas, and his life had effectively collapsed around his ears 2 hours ago. There was something about her presence that was neither demanding nor distant, just steady, like a good fire on a cold night. The Baxter homestead appeared as a cluster of dark shapes against the lighter sky, with a single lamp burning in a window. Their knock on the door was answered after a few minutes by a stout, practical-looking woman of about 50 in a housecoat who held a lamp up to their faces with the alert eyes of a frontier woman who has been opening doors to strangers at night for decades and has developed sound judgment about them. "Eliza Langley," she said, with recognition and genuine warmth. "Lord child, what happened to you?" "Broken axle, Mrs. Baxter," Eliza said. "I'm sorry to come so late. This is Ezekiel Covington. He was kind enough to ride with me." Mrs. Baxter looked at Ezekiel with the particular assessing gaze of a woman who has raised sons and has strong opinions about men in general. Whatever she saw must have been acceptable, because she pulled the door wider. "Get those horses settled and come in," she said. "I'll put on coffee." They saw to the horses together, working in quiet, efficient partnership in the Baxter barn, finding stalls and hay and water with the ease of two people who both knew what needed doing around animals. Working beside her in the amber light of a barn lantern, Ezekiel noticed the way she moved, unhurried but never still, always doing the next sensible thing, the way a person moves when they were raised doing real work, and it has become as natural as breathing. Inside, Mrs. Baxter's kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the coffee she produced was strong enough to satisfy even Eliza's standards, which Ezekiel could tell by the slight relaxation in her shoulders when she tasted it. They sat at the kitchen table and explained the situation, the wagon, the axle, the miles still to go, and Mrs. Baxter listened and nodded and did not cluck or fuss, just absorbed the information and began applying solutions to it. "Hank can take the wagon into Laredo with the team tomorrow and have the axle looked at," she said, meaning her husband. "It'll take 2 days to repair, likely. You're welcome here until it's done." She looked at Ezekiel. "You too, Mr. Covington. We can always use an extra hand. Hank has been saying for 2 weeks that he needs help mending the fence along the south pasture." Ezekiel accepted with genuine gratitude, because the alternative was riding back to a ranch that no longer belonged to him, and sleeping in a house he had built with his own hands, knowing he had lost the ground beneath it. He slept that night on a cot in the Baxter barn, which was warm and smelled of hay and horses, and while he did not sleep well, his mind kept turning over the events of the evening with the restless insistence of a mind that cannot yet accept the size of a mistake. He was grateful for the warmth and the shelter, and the fact that Duchess was close by in her stall, breathing steady and unhurried in the way that horses do, which is one of the most calming sounds in the world. In the morning, the light came in through gaps in the barn boards in long, warm stripes, and Ezekiel lay on his cot for a moment, looking at the dust motes moving in those stripes of light and taking stock of where he was. 28 years old, 3 years' work gone in one evening. No land, no money, a good horse and a good rifle, and the particular stubborn determination that had gotten him to 80 acres in the first place, and which did not seem likely to abandon him just because those 80 acres were now in someone else's pocket. He got up and washed his face at the pump in the barnyard and found Eliza Langley already there, sitting on the top rail of the fence beside the corral with a cup of coffee from the house and her dark eyes fixed on the morning horizon with the thoughtful expression of a woman working through something in her mind. She heard him at the pump and glanced over. She had changed from her traveling dress into simpler work clothes, and her hair was pinned back more loosely than the night before in a way that suited her better. "Mrs. Baxter's coffee is exceptional," she said, raising the cup slightly. "She seems like a woman of excellent judgment," he said. Eliza looked at him for a moment. "How are you this morning?" she asked, and it was a genuine question, not a polite one. He thought about lying or about giving the easy answer men usually give. "I've been better," he said instead. "But I've also been worse, probably. I'm trying to remember when, which I expect is a reasonable way to spend a morning after a disaster." She smiled at that, and it was a real smile, not the polite kind. It reached all the way to her eyes and changed her whole face, and Ezekiel felt it in his chest like a struck match. "It's a good discipline," she said. "Context helps." He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had carried out with her and sat on the fence rail a few feet away from her, and they watched the morning come in together, the light spreading warm and golden across the dry Texas grass, the mockingbirds doing their morning work in the mesquite, a pair of jackrabbits moving at the edge of the far field. "Tell me about the land," she said. "The 80 acres. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you lost it last night and you've barely spoken of it," she said. "And sometimes speaking of a thing makes it real in a way that helps." He was quiet for a moment. "It was good land," he said. "Mostly flat, good grass, a creek running through the northeast corner that didn't dry up even in the worst of the August heat last summer. I built the house myself over 2 winters. It wasn't large, but it was solid. I had 23 head of cattle going into this spring and sold 18 at market yesterday. I kept 5 back to build the herd next year." He paused because it occurred to him that those 5 cattle also technically now belonged to Daltrey since they ran on the land the deed covered. "I don't suppose those 5 cattle are mine anymore either." "No," she said quietly. "I don't suppose they are." He exhaled slowly. "I'm not a gambling man," he said. "I want you to understand that. Last night was not. I don't do that as a habit. I had money in my pocket and a good evening behind me, and I sat down at a table with strangers, and I made the particular kind of bad decision that a man makes when he feels invincible." "I know," she said. "How do you know?" She considered this. "Because you said it plainly." A gambling man would make excuses. He'd say the game was crooked or his luck was bad or the other players were sharps. She looked at him. "You just said you made a bad decision." "It was a very bad decision," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "But recognizing it clearly is the beginning of doing something about it." Hank Baxter proved to be exactly the kind of man his wife was, the kind of woman solid, practical, without excess opinion or sentiment, entirely competent. He listened to the wagon situation over breakfast, said he would load it behind his team and take it into Laredo that morning, and helped Ezekiel carry the trunks and crates from Eliza's wagon to the barn for safekeeping. He also put Ezekiel to work on the south pasture fence without ceremony, handing him tools and pointing at the damaged sections with the quiet confidence of a man who assumes that another man can do the work if given the implements. Ezekiel spent the morning working alongside Hank Baxter's teenage son, Thomas, mending fence in the warming Texas sun, and it was good, honest work that required his hands and his back and not too much of his mind, which left his mind free to do what it would inevitably do, which was to turn over the problem of his future with the thoroughgoing attention of a man who has nothing else pressing. He had skills. He knew cattle work as well as anyone in Frio County, better than most. He could break horses, which was reliable income on the frontier. He could track and he could shoot, though he had no particular appetite for the kind of work that required shooting. He had built a house from raw materials and learned the fencing and the plowing and the whole practical vocabulary of running a small ranch. He had done it once on nothing, and he could do it again. The question was where. The land in Frio County was gone, and he could not afford to buy back a deed without capital. He would need to work for someone else long enough to rebuild his savings, and that would take time, a year at minimum, probably more. The thought was not defeat exactly, but it sat heavy in his chest like a stone he would have to carry for a while. At noon, Mrs. Baxter sent Thomas back to the house with a message that lunch was ready, and Ezekiel walked back across the dry grass with a feeling in his shoulders that was half physical fatigue and half the particular weight of consequence. He washed his hands at the pump and found Eliza in the kitchen helping Mrs. Baxter with the noon meal, the two of them moving around each other in the easy way of women who are both comfortable in kitchens and have quickly established the natural geometry of sharing one. Eliza glanced up when he came in and something passed across her face, a brief assessment, or perhaps just recognition, before she turned back to the biscuits she was working on. Lunch at the Baxter table was good and filling: salt pork and beans, and those biscuits and gravy. And the conversation was the practical, comfortable kind that people have when they are all doing real work and have real things to talk about. Hank reported that the livery in Laredo thought the axle repair would take until Thursday at earliest, and Mrs. Baxter took this news with the equanimity of a woman who has long since made her peace with the fact that plans in the frontier tend to require modification. Ezekiel helped clear the table, which earned him a look of mild surprise from Thomas and a look of something more complicated from Eliza, who he suspected was filing this information away somewhere. In the afternoon, Eliza wrote a letter to her Aunt Margaret explaining the delay, and Hank rode to a neighboring homestead where there was a man who carried letters south to the stage line. Ezekiel repaired the remaining broken fence sections, and then, because Hank mentioned offhandedly that one of his horses had been going uneven and he couldn't quite identify the cause, Ezekiel spent an hour with the horse, checking each hoof methodically until he found a small stone wedged at the back of the left rear shoe in a way that would have been easy to miss. He was working the stone loose with his hoof pick when he became aware that someone was watching him, and he looked up to find Eliza standing at the fence rail with her arms folded on the top board and her chin resting on her arms, watching him work. "You're good with horses," she said. "I like horses," he said. "They're honest. They respond to what you actually do, not to what you tell them." She was quiet for a moment, watching him ease the stone free. The horse, a bay gelding named Clay, exhaled with what sounded remarkably like relief as the stone came out. Ezekiel ran his thumb around the hoof to check for bruising. "My uncle used to say that a man who is patient with horses is usually patient with people too," she said. "Your uncle sounds like he had sounder opinions than just the ones about coffee," Ezekiel said. She laughed softly, and the sound of it was like water over smooth stones, easy and genuine. "He did," she said. "In most things." She paused. "I miss him." "Of course you do," he said. He set Clay's hoof down and stood, and the horse turned to investigate his pockets in the optimistic way of horses, which Ezekiel tolerated because he happened to have half a piece of hardtack in his coat pocket that he offered on a flat palm. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said. "Yes," he said. "What do you intend to do? Once the wagon is repaired and you've helped Hank with his fences and the decent thing you're doing here is done, what then?" He looked at her. The late afternoon sun was hitting the side of her face and making the dark of her hair pick up a warm reddish tone, and she was looking at him with those direct eyes that seemed entirely uninterested in anything other than the honest answer. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm going to ride up toward my old ranch and see what's what. Determine if Daltrey intends to work the land himself or sell it. If he sells, I might be able to work toward buying it back eventually. If not, I'll look for work on someone else's spread and rebuild from nothing." He paused. "I've started from nothing before." "You have," she said, not as a question but as an acknowledgement. "The hardest part," he said, "is knowing what's there. I built that house. I know every board in it. I know the way the light comes through the window in the east wall in the morning. I know where the creek runs fast and where it goes slow." He stopped because he was saying more than he intended. "Losing what you built is different from losing what you had." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, with a quality in her voice that made him think she understood that distinction from the inside, not just as a concept. "Have you lost something you built?" he asked. She unfolded her arms from the fence rail and looked out across the Baxter pasture for a moment. "Not the way you have," she said, "but I left something in New Mexico territory when I came to San Antonio, a life I had been building, a different kind than yours, but still." She paused. "I left it for good reasons, and I'd make the same choice again, but the leaving still cost something. He wanted to ask what kind of life, what good reasons, but he didn't, because there was a careful quality to how she said it that suggested it was not yet territory she was offering to share, and he respected that. "Tell me about your aunt's homestead," he said instead. "The one you're going to." And she did. She told him about the Langley place north of Laredo, a homestead her Uncle Clarence had built up over 15 years to about 200 acres of mixed land, good for both cattle and a small crop of corn and sorghum. Her Aunt Margaret was 60 years old and had been doing the work of two people since Clarence's death the previous October, and Eliza's plan was to stay through the summer and into the fall harvest, help stabilize the operation, and then assess from there. "She doesn't have anyone else?" Ezekiel asked. "A son in Kansas City," Eliza said, with a tone that communicated clearly that the son in Kansas City was not going to be riding south to help. "My cousin Franklin made his choices clear a long time ago. He's a banker now, which I suppose is admirable enough, but he has not been home since the summer of 1874, and I don't expect that to change." "So you came." "So I came," she said simply. He found himself thinking in the evening after supper, sitting on the Baxters' porch with a cup of coffee and the night sounds coming in from the surrounding land, that Eliza Langley was one of the most self-possessed people he had ever met. She was not hard or cold or distant. She was warm and funny and direct in conversation, and when she laughed it was a full and genuine thing. But there was a quality of settled certainty about her. She knew what she thought, she knew what she valued, and she was not available to be persuaded by anything other than good evidence and honest argument. He found this enormously attractive, in a way that surprised him somewhat because it was not the kind of thing he usually noticed first about women. She came out onto the porch and sat in the other chair with her own coffee, and the night settled around them both. And they talked for 2 hours about things that mattered, about what made land worth working, about what he had read and she had read, about the question of whether the cattle business in Texas would survive the pressure of the big northern railheads changing the market, about what she thought had gone wrong and how the government handled the question of tribal lands in New Mexico territory, which she spoke about with a heat and a clarity that told him she had seen the injustice of it up close and not from a comfortable distance. "The Mescalero Apache in our part of the territory had been on that land for generations," she said, with a controlled but genuine anger that was clearly not freshly formed but had been sitting in her long enough to become a matter of settled conviction. What was done to force the removal was wrong. It was legally dubious even by the government's own laws, and it was morally indefensible. My father said so plainly, and my father was not a man given to radical positions. He just had eyes and could see what was happening to people. "A lot of people with eyes closed them," Ezekiel said. "Yes," she said. "A lot of people with eyes closed them." She looked at him. "What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment because he had thought about it, particularly when he had worked his own land and understood what it meant to have the ground beneath your feet be the thing upon which your life was built. "I think it was theft," he said plainly. "Large scale and government sanction, but theft. What name you put on it doesn't change what it is." She held his gaze for a moment. "It doesn't," she agreed. They sat quietly after that, but it was the comfortable quiet of two people who have found unexpected common ground and are sitting with the pleasantness of it. When they said good night, she stood from her chair and turned to go inside, and then stopped and looked back at him over her shoulder with an expression he couldn't quite parse, thoughtful and warm, and something else he didn't yet have a word for. "I'm glad the axle broke," she said. He looked at her. "If it hadn't," she said, "we wouldn't have met, and I think meeting you might be the best thing that's happened to me on this trip." She paused. "Good night, Mr. Covington." She went inside, and Ezekiel Covington sat on the porch of a stranger's house in the Texas night with no money and no land, and a warm certainty in his chest that was entirely different from the invincibility he had felt before sitting down at that card table, but considerably more substantial. He stayed 2 days at the Baxters, working alongside Hank each morning, and spending the evenings in conversation with Eliza in a way that felt increasingly like a necessary thing, like water or air, something his system had quietly decided it required. On the second afternoon, she asked him to teach her a repair he was doing on one of Hank's bridles, a particular kind of leather stitching that her uncle had never gotten around to teaching her, and they sat side by side on the porch steps in the afternoon sun with the leather and the tools between them, and he showed her the technique, and she learned it quickly and did it cleanly. And there was a moment when he was guiding her fingers to the right angle of the awl and her hand was warm under his, and they were both very aware of the warmth, though neither said anything about it. On Thursday morning, Hank Baxter returned from Laredo with Eliza's wagon, the axle repaired by the liveryman, and a new spoke fitted to the rear wheel, sturdy enough to make the remaining 12 miles to the Langley homestead without incident. They loaded Eliza's trunks back into the wagon, and she thanked the Baxters with genuine warmth, pressing Mrs. Baxter's hand in both of hers, and there was a small emotional exchange between the two women that Ezekiel politely did not watch too closely. He had been thinking about what he was going to do now. What he had come to, in 2 days of working Hank Baxter's fence and sitting on the porch in the evening, and talking with Eliza until the stars were deep overhead, was a kind of clarity that had been missing since he walked out of the Broken Spur Saloon 2 nights ago. He knew that riding back to his former ranch to mope at a house he no longer owned was not a plan, and he knew that finding work was something he could manage. What he also knew, with a certainty that was not rational but felt entirely solid, was that he did not want to part from Eliza Langley quite yet. "I'll ride with you to your aunt's," he said, when they were loading the last of the luggage. "The road goes right past my old property anyway. I'll see about getting some of my tools and personal effects that are in the house if Daltrey hasn't taken up residence yet." She was hitching Belle to the wagon and she looked at him over the horse's back with a level gaze. "You don't need to do that for my sake," she said. "My axle is fixed." "I know," he said. "I'd like to." She held his gaze for a moment and then the corner of her mouth moved. "Then come," she said. They left the Baxter homestead mid-morning on a Thursday with the sky high and blue, and the mockingbirds going in the brush along the road. He rode Duchess alongside the wagon, and Eliza drove Belle with the easy, relaxed competence of a woman who had in fact been driving wagons since before she could read, the reins held lightly, her eyes easy on the road. They talked the whole 12 miles, which passed more quickly than 12 miles usually did. She told him about growing up in New Mexico territory on her father's ranch outside of Chilarosa, about learning to shoot and ride and work cattle alongside her 2 older brothers, about her mother who had died of fever when Eliza was 12, and whose absence had been a permanent weather in the household after that, about teaching herself to read more thoroughly by going through every book in the territory school and then writing away for more. "What kinds of books?" he asked. "All kinds," she said. "But especially ones about places I hadn't been and couldn't yet go. History, geography, natural philosophy. And novels, which my father thought were a waste of good eyesight, but he was wrong about that." "What kind of novels?" She considered this with the same seriousness she brought to everything. "The ones where the people in them feel real," she said, "where you believe they're actually alive somewhere and the story is just the part you happen to catch." He understood that. "What made you leave New Mexico territory?" he asked, revisiting the question he had not pressed before and watching her face to see if she wanted to answer. She was quiet for a moment. "I was engaged to be married," she said. 3 years ago, a man named Warren Holt who owned the ranch adjacent to my father's. He was a good man in the practical ways, hardworking, respected in the community, not cruel." She paused. "But he did not respect my opinions or my intelligence, and when I began to understand that, I began to understand that a marriage built on his willingness to overlook most of who I am would not make either of us happy." "How did he take it?" Ezekiel asked. "When you called it off?" "Badly at first," she said. And then with a dignity that I respected him for, once the first badly part was over, she glanced at him. My father took it harder, honestly. He had wanted that land consolidation for years, a dry note in her voice. But he understood eventually. He understood that I was going to do what I was going to do, she said, with a small smile. My father understood that about me from a very early age. He didn't always agree with it, but he understood it. Ezekiel nodded slowly. He was building a picture of her, piece by piece, and what the picture was showing him was a woman who had very deliberately chosen the life she was living over the easier version of it that would have cost her less but given her less too. "What about you?" she asked. "Have you been close to marrying?" "Once," he said, "in Missouri before I came to Texas. A woman named Caroline Fletcher. We understood each other well enough for about 6 months, and then I started talking about going west, and she was entirely clear that west was not where she intended to go, and I was entirely clear that west was where I was going." He paused. "It was mutual, amicable. We each had what we wanted, and those things weren't the same thing." "Do you regret it?" she asked. "No," he said, and meant it. "Caroline married a shopkeeper in Jefferson City, and I hear she's quite happy, which seems exactly right." Eliza drove in silence for a moment. "You said you came to Texas and started on nothing," she said. "How old were you?" 25, he said. "And now you're 28, she said. She was doing the arithmetic visibly, laying the timeline out in her mind with the methodical precision that he was coming to recognize as characteristic of how she thought about things. 28 and starting over, he confirmed. "But with 3 more years of experience than I had the first time, which is something." "It's considerable," she said, with a conviction that felt like it was meant to be heard, not just said. The Langley homestead came into view in the early afternoon. A solid house with a wide porch, a good barn, a working windmill, and several outbuildings arranged in the practical, no-nonsense geometry of a homestead that had been built by people who knew what they were doing. The grass around the house needed cutting, and one of the fence rails along the house yard was down, and the garden at the side of the house showed the signs of a woman who had been too busy or too tired to give it the attention it wanted. But the bones of the place were sound, and it had the character of somewhere that had been genuinely cared for over many years. On the porch, a small, straight-backed woman with gray hair and bright dark eyes that were unmistakably related to Eliza's stood up from her chair and came to the porch rail with an expression of relief, so profound it was almost painful to see. "Eliza," she said. "Aunt Margaret," Eliza said, and had the wagon stopped and was down and moving before it fully stilled, and the two women embraced on the porch steps with the particular fierceness of family reunions that have been too long in coming. Ezekiel stayed on Duchess at a respectful distance and looked at the homestead. The work that needed doing was immediately visible to someone who had run his own spread, and there was a great deal of it, the kind of accumulation that happens when one person is trying to do what 2 people designed the operation to manage. When the first of the reunion had settled, Eliza brought him forward and introduced him to her aunt, explaining the broken axle and the Baxters and how they had met. Margaret Langley looked at Ezekiel with much the same intensity as her niece, the dark eyes steady and evaluating. "You helped Eliza on the road," she said. "I was going the same direction," he said. "It was no hardship. He's being modest," Eliza said. "He led my horse 3 miles through the dark on a borrowed bit and didn't complain once." Margaret Langley studied him for another moment. "We have a spare room," she said, "and I expect Eliza will tell me you're between situations. You're welcome to stay as long as you need in exchange for what help you can give around the place." It was a practical offer, made without sentimentality but with genuine directness, and Ezekiel accepted it with equal directness. Because pride was a luxury he did not currently have the funds to maintain, and because working this land for a time while he figured out his next step seemed considerably more productive than riding aimlessly. The weeks that followed established themselves into a rhythm that Ezekiel had not anticipated when he rode into Laredo on that Tuesday evening with his cattle money and his false confidence. He rose each day before first light and worked the Langley homestead from sunup to sundown, repairing fences, clearing brush from the south field, mucking out the barn and mending the rotten boards in the floor, getting the garden back into order, riding the fence lines to assess what needed addressing, tending the 20 head of cattle that Margaret had been managing mostly alone. It was good, familiar work, and he did it with his whole attention. In the evenings, the three of them sat on the wide porch or around the kitchen table, and Eliza read aloud while her aunt mended, which was a domestic arrangement so pleasant it occasionally startled Ezekiel when he noticed how comfortable he had become with it. He listened to the book she chose. She was currently working through a collection of essays and a novel that had come west with her in one of her trunks, and he asked questions and argued about ideas, and found himself sitting forward in his chair with the animated attention of someone who had not had this kind of conversation regularly and had not known how much he missed it. He was falling in love with her. He knew it with a clear, unsentimental certainty, the way he knew when a fence line needed mending or a horse was off, not because he was looking for the sign, but because it was simply there to be seen when you were paying attention, and Ezekiel Covington paid attention. He had been paying attention to Eliza Langley since the moment she crouched beside him on the moonlit road and looked at a broken axle with the same analytical calm she brought to everything. He did not immediately say anything about it, partly because he was not in a position to say much with no land and no money to his name, and partly because he wanted to be sure that what he saw in her manner toward him was what he thought it was, and not his own wishful interpretation. He had known men who convinced themselves they were loved and had been badly wrong, and he had a precise enough mind to want evidence before conclusion. The evidence accumulated slowly, and then all at once. It was in the way she found reasons to be working in whatever part of the homestead he happened to be working in, so that they ended up side by side at the chicken coop or the garden or the barn with a naturalness that seemed, on close examination, not entirely accidental. It was in the way she listened to him speak with her full attention, the dark eyes steady on his face, in a way that made him feel his words were actually being received rather than merely endured. It was in the way she touched his arm when she was emphasizing a point in a conversation, light and brief, but consistent and specific to him. It was in the way she laughed at his observations in a way that told him she was actually hearing the particular things he meant, and found them genuinely amusing rather than performing the laughter that people perform for strangers. It was, in a very specific and memorable way, in the evening 3 weeks after he had come to the Langley homestead, when they were walking the fence line along the east field in the gold late afternoon light, checking the repairs he had done that week, and she had stopped beside a section of fence where a large mockingbird was giving an extraordinary performance on the top rail, running through its full repertoire of imitated calls with an intensity that suggested genuine artistic commitment. They both stopped to listen without planning to, and stood there together in the warm light while the mockingbird sang, and Eliza's shoulder was against his arm in the comfortable, unguarded proximity of two people who have stopped being careful about distance, and he turned to look at her face and found her already looking at his, and in the mockingbird's borrowed song and the gold light and the warm evening, he understood with complete clarity that the evidence was sufficient. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was not an answer to the question he hadn't yet asked but a response to the look on his face, and it was the most direct and uncomplicated and heartening yes he had ever heard in his life. He kissed her, there in the east field with the mockingbird carrying on unreasonably overhead, and she kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything, fully present, fully herself, entirely honest. When they pulled apart, she was looking at him with those dark eyes warm and something in them that was very like joy. "I have been waiting for you to do that," she said, "for approximately 2 weeks and 4 days. He laughed, genuinely surprised. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was curious what you were waiting for," she said, "and also because I wanted to be sure." She paused. "I am sure." "So am I," he said. They stood in the east field for a little while longer than was strictly necessary to check fence line, and then walked back to the homestead together in the evening light, and the world looked different to Ezekiel in the particular way that the world looks different after a thing you have been moving toward for weeks has finally, unmistakably happened. Margaret Langley was sitting on the porch when they came back, and she looked at them once with those sharp, dark eyes, and then looked back at the horizon with a small, satisfied expression that she made no effort to hide. She was not a woman who hid things she had no reason to hide. That evening at supper, the conversation was easy and warm and occasionally punctuated by Eliza and Ezekiel looking at each other across the table with the slightly dazed awareness of a new beginning, which Margaret managed with the tact of a woman who understood what love looked like and had the wisdom to simply leave it room to breathe. Later, on the porch in the dark, after Margaret had gone inside, Eliza sat beside him with her shoulder against his and her coffee cup held in both hands, and they talked as they always talked, ranging widely across everything, but now with the easy physical awareness of two people who have crossed from one kind of closeness to another and find the new territory considerably better. "What happens next?" she asked, not anxiously but with the forward-looking practicality he loved in her. "I'm going to get my land back," he said. It was the first time he had said it as a certainty rather than a hope, and it came out with a solidity that surprised him with its own definiteness. "I've been making inquiries. A man named Calloway over near Catarina is looking for someone to break horses for him through the fall. He has 15 unbroken animals he bought at auction that he needs ready for sale by winter. The pay would give me a foundation to work from, and breaking horses is something I can do as well as anyone in the county." "Calloway is a good rancher," Eliza said. "I've heard my aunt mention him." "I'm going to ride over there in the next week and have that conversation," he said. "And I'm going to look into what Daltrey has done with my land. If he's planning to sell it, I want to know what the asking price is. And if you can't buy it back." She asked not to discourage him, but because she was the kind of person who believed in examining all the scenarios, not just the preferred one. "Then I'll find other land," he said. "There's still land to be had in Frio County and Webb County both. It won't be the land I built on, and that's a loss I'll have to make my peace with. But the work I did was in me before I did it, and it's still in me now. I can do it again." She turned to look at him in the dark. "I believe you," she said. He rode to see Calloway the following week, and the conversation was productive. Calloway was a blunt, honest man who cared more about whether you could do the work than about your history. And after watching Ezekiel work with one of his green horses for 20 minutes in the breaking pen, he offered a contract for the fall season at a rate that Ezekiel accepted without hesitation. He also, while he was in the area, made discreet inquiries about Daltrey through the county's various informal networks, the feed store, the blacksmith, the land office, and learned that Daltrey was, in fact, not himself a ranching man and had been making noise about selling the Frio County property, but had not yet found a buyer. This was better news than Ezekiel had allowed himself to hope for, and he rode back to the Langley homestead in the September afternoon with something he had not felt since before the card game, which was a genuine and grounded optimism. Not the reckless invincibility of a man with cattle money in his pocket, but the quieter and more durable confidence of someone who has been through the worst of a thing and found his footing again. He found Eliza in the garden when he returned, pulling the last of the late summer tomatoes with her hands dusty and her hair escaping its pins in the heat. She straightened when she heard Duchess on the path and shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun. He told her what Calloway had said and what he had learned about Daltrey, and she listened with her whole attention, the tomatoes forgotten in the basket on the ground. "Daltrey is motivated to sell," Ezekiel said. "He's a card sharp, not a rancher. Land that he can't work himself is just a deed in his pocket, and a deed in his pocket doesn't pay his saloon bills. If I can put together an offer before winter, I think he'll take it." "How much will you need?" she asked. He told her the figure he had calculated, what Calloway would pay for the horse breaking, what he had set aside from his 2 months of work at the Langley homestead, and what he would still be short of a fair purchase price for the land. Eliza looked at him with an expression that was considering something, and he recognized the look because he had seen it on her face before when she was about to say something that she had thought through carefully and was ready to commit to. "I have money of my own," she said, "from the sale of my father's property when he died 2 years ago. My brothers each had their portions and mine is mine, and I have it in a bank in San Antonio." She met his eyes. "I could contribute the remainder." He looked at her. The offer was generous and genuine, and it made him feel a complicated, warm tangle of things. "Eliza," he said carefully, "I don't want to take your money." "I'm not offering to give it to you," she said, with a precision that was characteristic. "I'm offering to invest it in a future that I intend to be part of." She paused. "That is, if you intended to ask me to be part of it." He got down from Duchess and walked to where she was standing in the garden and looked at her at close range, at the sun on her face and the tomato dust on her hands and the direct, clear, certain look in her dark eyes. "Eliza Langley," he said, "I have been intending to ask you to be part of it since approximately the second evening on the Baxter porch. I've just been waiting until I had something to offer that was worthy of the question." "You were something to offer from the first evening," she said quietly. "Land and money are practical things and I care about practical things, but they're not what I'm saying yes to." "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It is very much a yes," she said. He took both her hands, tomato dust and all, and she looked up at him with a smile that was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 28 years of looking at things. He kissed her in the garden with the late September sun warm and the tomato plants rustling in the slight afternoon wind, and she kissed him back with the straightforward, wholehearted quality she brought to every honest thing. From the porch, where she had been sitting in plain view the whole time with very deliberate, unseeing industry applied to her mending, Margaret Langley smiled at the fabric in her lap and did not look up. The following months had a shape to them, a structure of work and planning, and the growing intimacy of two people learning the full landscape of each other. Ezekiel rode to Callaway's ranch 4 days a week through October and November, breaking the 15 horses in Callaway's string with patience and skill, and the work was satisfying in the particular way of work that you are genuinely good at. He broke each horse individually, spending the time required, never hurrying the process, because you could hurry a horse and produce an animal that was technically broke but not trustworthy, or you could do it properly and produce an animal that was worth what you asked for it. Callaway watched him work and paid him promptly and mentioned him to other ranchers in the county in the straightforward way of a satisfied employer, and by the time November came, Ezekiel had 2 additional offers for the winter season, which he accepted. On the 3 days he was at the Langley homestead each week, he and Eliza fell into the comfortable practicality of a partnership that was already functioning as what they had agreed it would become. She was his equal partner in every meaningful sense, in conversation, in planning, in opinion, and he was learning that this was not, as he had occasionally heard other men suggest, a complication or a reduction of a man's authority. It was simply better. 2 minds working a problem together, when both minds were capable and honest, arrived at better conclusions than one mind working it alone, and Eliza's mind was the sharpest he had ever had the pleasure of working alongside. She was also helping her aunt through what the doctor in Laredo diagnosed in October as a heart condition that was manageable but required rest and care. And Eliza organized the homestead around her aunt's limitations with the same systematic competence she brought to everything, without making Margaret feel diminished or managed, which was a considerable feat given that Margaret Langley was a woman of strong will and firm opinions about her own autonomy. Ezekiel had the money together by December. His wages from Callaway's contract and the additional horses he had broken, combined with the careful savings from his Langley work, and when Eliza added her portion from San Antonio, they had enough for a fair offer on the 80 acres in Frio County. He rode to Laredo on a cold December morning and found Daltrey in the same saloon where this whole story had begun, which struck Ezekiel as fitting in a way he could acknowledge with equanimity now, the full circle of it. Daltrey was playing cards but not winning, which was also fitting, and when Ezekiel sat down across from him, not at the card table but at a corner table away from the game, and laid out his offer for the land, Daltrey looked at the figure, and then at Ezekiel with the calculating expression of a man adding up whether the offer was fair or whether he could squeeze more. "I might get more from someone else," Daltrey said. "You might," Ezekiel agreed, with a steadiness that was entirely genuine. "You've had the land 6 months and not found another buyer, so I expect you know the market. This is a fair offer for the current condition of the property and the improvements already on it. I built those improvements and I know what they're worth, so I'm not going to pay you more than fair value for my own work." Daltrey looked at him for a long moment and then at the money on the table. "You seem different than you were in June," he said. "I am different than I was in June," Ezekiel said. "Different in the ways that matter." Daltrey took the money. He signed the paper that Ezekiel had drawn up by a lawyer in Laredo, and the deed to 80 acres in Frio County changed hands across a corner table in the same saloon where it had been lost 6 months before. The irony of this was not lost on Ezekiel, and he permitted himself a moment to appreciate it before folding the deed into his breast pocket, the same breast pocket where it had ridden before, the same faded creases in the paper, now with a new date and a new signature at the bottom. He rode out of Laredo on Duchess in the December cold with the deed in his pocket, and the particular feeling of a man who has set right what he set wrong, which is a very specific and satisfying feeling that not everyone gets the chance to experience. He rode straight to the Langley homestead, and Eliza met him on the porch because she had heard Duchess on the road and had come out with the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for news. He dismounted and went up the porch steps and took the deed from his pocket and held it out to her, and she took it and unfolded it and read it, and when she looked up her eyes were bright. "You have your land back," she said. "We have our land," he said. She came to him and held his face in both her hands and kissed him with a warmth and a depth that said everything a sentence might fall short of. And behind them, through the window, Margaret Langley, who had pretended very credibly not to be watching, allowed herself a broad and unconcealed smile. They were married in February of 1879 in the Laredo Episcopal Church on a cold, bright day, with Margaret Langley in the front pew looking composed and emotional in equal measure, and Hank and Mrs. Baxter in attendance, because it had seemed right to invite them given the role the broken axle on a moonlit road had played in the whole proceedings. The Calloway family came as well, and 2 of the neighboring ranchers who had become friends over the fall season of horse breaking, and the church was warm with the body heat of people who had come out in the February cold because they genuinely wished these 2 people well. Eliza wore a dress of deep green wool that her aunt had helped her make in the weeks before the wedding, and she walked up the aisle with her chin level and her dark eyes on Ezekiel's face with the direct, settled certainty that was entirely characteristic of her, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him feeling things that no vocabulary yet invented was quite equal to. They said their vows with the unhurried, deliberate quality of 2 people who mean what they're saying precisely, and the minister, a young man from Virginia who had come to Texas with more enthusiasm than experience but solid intentions, felt that this particular ceremony was one of the most genuine he had performed. After the reception at the Langley homestead, Mrs. Baxter had contributed an extraordinary quantity of food, and her opinion that this was the best sort of wedding, small and honest and well-provisioned. They rode out to the Frio County property together in the last of the winter afternoon. The house was as Ezekiel had left it when he rode away on the night of the card game, except that Daltrey had clearly been there at some point and left the back door open for a season, which had let in enough weather that the wood stove would need a thorough cleaning. The house was cold and smelled of disuse and mouse, and there were cobwebs in the corners and a shutter that had come loose and needed remounting, and the garden space on the south side was entirely overgrown. Eliza walked through every room with her hands clasped in front of her and her head tilted slightly, taking it in. He followed and watched her process the space, the main room with the fireplace he had built with stones from the creek, the kitchen with the good shelves he had put in over the second winter, the 2 bedrooms at the back that he had built with an optimism about the future of the place that he had not entirely articulated to himself at the time. In the second bedroom, she stopped and turned to him. "You built 2 bedrooms," she said. "I did," he said. She looked at him with something warm and knowing in her eyes. "Ezekiel James Covington," she said, "you were planning for a family before you even knew who it would be." He felt the back of his neck warm slightly. "I knew what I hoped for," he said. She came to him and took his hands. "Tell me what you hoped for," she said. "A wife," he said, "children, a life that meant something beyond the work itself. A person I could talk to at the end of the day who would actually hear what I was saying." He paused. "I just hadn't met you yet." She squeezed his hands. "You've met me now," she said. "I have," he said. They spent the first night of their marriage in a house that smelled of disuse and needed considerable work, sleeping on a borrowed bedroll that Margaret had sent with them, because Eliza was practical enough to anticipate this exact situation, and Ezekiel could not have told you a single thing in the world that he would have changed about it. The spring of 1879 brought Eliza's energy and taste to the Frio County house in a way that transformed it without erasing what he had built. She whitewashed the interior walls and replaced the loose shutter, and put her hand to the garden with the vigor of someone who had been waiting for their own ground to put things in. They worked side by side on the spring repairs with the comfortable industry of a genuine partnership, and the cattle that had been waiting out the winter on the Langley homestead's pasture under Ezekiel's arrangement with Margaret were brought south to the Frio County land and turned out on the good grass by the creek. Margaret came to visit in April, making the trip in a wagon driven by Thomas Baxter, whom she had hired for the purpose, and she walked through the house and the garden and looked at the cattle and the mended fences and the repaired barn with the satisfaction of someone seeing a thing turn out as it should. "Clarence would have liked you," she told Ezekiel, sitting on the porch in the April sun. "He'd have had opinions about the fence post intervals, mind you. He always had opinions about fence post intervals." "At what distance?" Ezekiel asked. Margaret told him, and Ezekiel, after some reflection, acknowledged that Clarence had probably been right. That summer, with the cattle doing well and the garden producing more than they could eat, and the horse-breaking work continuing to bring in the steady additional income that padded their foundation, Eliza told Ezekiel on a warm July evening that she was pregnant. She told him simply and directly, as she told him everything, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the supper things not yet cleared, and she watched his face as she said it with the calm of someone who is sure of the news but not yet certain of the reception. He stared at her for a moment. Then the feeling that came up through him was so large and clean that it came out as tears, which surprised him considerably, as he had not cried since his horse got spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him into a fence post when he was 12 years old. Eliza looked at his face with wide eyes. "Ezekiel," she said softly. "I'm all right," he said, somewhat inaccurately, given the tears. "I'm very all right." He reached across the table and took her hands. "Eliza, that's the best news you've ever given me, and you have given me considerable good news." She squeezed his hands and her eyes were bright too, though she was not crying, which was characteristic. She was smiling with the full, real smile that reached her eyes, and she was looking at him with an expression that contained so much that he felt he could spend the rest of his life examining it and find new things in it. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair, and held her face in his hands with the kind of careful reverence that you give to things that are precious to you. And she put her hands over his. And they stayed like that in the kitchen of the house he had built and won back, and she had helped him make into a home, in the Texas evening with the summer sounds coming through the open window. And it was exactly the life he had been reaching for, since he pointed himself west, without quite being able to describe what he was reaching for. Margaret was informed by letter, and responded with a response that was brief, practical, and contained a specific recommendation about what Eliza should eat, and a particular combination of herbs from her garden that she vouched for from experience, and an additional line at the end that was uncharacteristically sentimental even for Margaret, and that Eliza read with a moisture in her eyes that she attributed to the heat. In the fall of 1879, Ezekiel rode to Laredo on Duchess, and returned with a young, good-looking bay stallion he had traded for at the horse market, which he intended to use for breeding with the mares he was building the horse side of the operation around, because the horse business had proven to be not merely supplementary income, but a genuine enterprise worth developing. He also came back with a crate of books from the dry goods store, a new shipment that the storekeeper had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, and which included 3 novels and a volume of natural history essays that he had quietly noted Eliza had mentioned wanting without expectation when they had been in town the month before. He carried them into the house with the studied nonchalance of a man pretending he has not been particularly thoughtful, and Eliza unpacked the crate and found the books and looked at him over the crate's edge with an expression that made the nonchalance entirely impossible to maintain. "Ezekiel Covington," she said. "I happened to be in the store," he said. "You remembered every single one," she said. "I pay attention," he said. She stood up and crossed the room and kissed him with a warmth that made his nonchalance and the horse market and the entire productive business day feel very distant and unimportant, and he held her with one arm and her and the growing evidence of their coming child with the other, and the books sat on the table behind her, patient and waiting. Their son was born in February of 1880, on a cold, clear night that smelled of frost and wood smoke, with Mrs. Baxter in attendance because she had quietly informed Ezekiel in December that she intended to be present because Eliza was like the daughter she never had, and he should not think about arguing the point. He had not thought about arguing the point. He had, in fact, felt enormous relief at the offer, because while he was fully capable of managing most situations, the prospect of the birth without experienced assistance had been the one thing in the preceding months that had kept him from sleeping entirely soundly. Eliza labored through the night with the fierce, focused intensity she brought to everything that mattered, and Mrs. Baxter managed the situation with the calm competence of a woman who had brought 7 children of her own into the world, and helped with the arrival of a considerable number of her neighbors' children as well. Ezekiel stayed close and was useful when Mrs. Baxter directed him, and stayed out of the way when she indicated that he was not currently needed, and paced the main room of the house in the intervals with the particular anxiety of a man who loves someone beyond his ability to help them. The cry came in the deep of the night, when the frost was heavy on the window glass, and Mrs. Baxter appeared in the doorway with a look on her face that he would remember for the rest of his life, and said simply, "You have a son." He went in and found Eliza propped up against the pillows with the exhausted, luminous face of someone who has done the hardest thing they have ever done, and is entirely aware of it, holding a bundled infant who was very small and very loud and entirely himself. "Come meet your son," Eliza said, with a tiredness and a joy in her voice that were somehow both at full volume simultaneously. He sat on the edge of the bed and she settled the baby into his arms, and he held his son for the first time and felt the weight of him and looked at the small, furious face, furious at the cold and the noise and the indignity of being suddenly outside when he had been comfortable and warm, which was an entirely reasonable response to the situation, and felt something open in his chest that had no name and did not need one. "What do we call him?" Eliza said. They had discussed names but not settled on one, and he looked at the baby and then at Eliza and then back at the baby. "Clarence," he said, "after your uncle." Eliza's face did something complicated and beautiful, and she held out her hand and he took it, and she squeezed it with the precise pressure of a woman who is feeling something she does not currently have the voice to say, and he squeezed back to tell her he heard her anyway. Clarence James Covington, who would be called Clarence or sometimes Clary before he grew old enough to have opinions about it, grew through his first year with the healthy stubbornness of a child who had been well-made and knew his own mind from the beginning. He had Ezekiel's coloring but Eliza's eyes, the direct, dark, measuring eyes that seemed to take in everything around them with an organized and purposeful attention. Margaret Langley rode south in the spring to meet him, and held him on the porch of the Frio County house in the April sun, with the expression of a woman who has been given something she needed without having known to ask for it. "Hello, Clarence," she said to the baby, with a formality that was somehow entirely appropriate. "Your Uncle Clarence was a very good man, and I think you might be too. We'll see." The baby reached up and grabbed her hat brim with a determined fist and pulled, and Margaret laughed with a fullness that Eliza told Ezekiel later she had not heard from her aunt since before her uncle's death. The years that followed were good years, the specific, substantive good that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from having the right people beside you when the difficulty comes. The cattle herd grew steadily, and the horse operation expanded, with the bay stallion proving an excellent investment as his offspring came of age and proved their quality in the county market. Ezekiel took on a ranch hand in 1881, a young man named Carlos Reyes who had come up from Mexico looking for honest work, and who was one of the best cattle hands Ezekiel had encountered, and whose family eventually settled on the neighboring 40 acres that came available in 1882. The house grew too. Ezekiel added a proper kitchen wing in the summer of 1881, because Eliza needed more space than the original design had accounted for, and she had made her needs clear and specific, and he had built exactly what she asked for. And the resulting kitchen was the room she spent the most time in. That wasn't the garden or the back pasture. In the spring of 1882, Eliza told him over the same kitchen table where she had told him about Clarence that there would be another child before winter. This time he did not cry, but the feeling that moved through him was of the same quality, large and clean and grateful in a way that went deeper than the word grateful usually reaches. Their daughter was born in October of 1882, with the fall light on the window and the smell of the harvest on the air. They named her Margaret Rose, and she arrived in the world with considerably more equanimity than her brother had, a calm, watchful baby who seemed to be taking in information from the first minutes and filing it away with a seriousness that was both endearing and slightly uncanny. Clarence, 2.5 years old and extremely definite about his place in the world, stood beside the bed and inspected his new sister with the methodical attention of someone conducting an assessment, and declared her acceptable. Ezekiel, watching this from the doorway, thought that Clarence had unmistakably gotten at least this tendency from his mother. Margaret Langley, for whom the baby was named, received the letter with Eliza's announcement and wrote back a response that arrived 3 weeks later, and that Eliza read aloud to Ezekiel at the kitchen table, and that concluded, "I am told that namesakes carry something of the named into the world. I hope this is true. I have lived a good life and would not mind some part of it continuing. Tell Ezekiel he has built something worth continuing, and I do not only mean the ranch." The winter of 1882 brought the worst cold that the Frio County area had seen in 15 years, with the creek freezing over for 3 consecutive weeks and the cattle needing daily breaking of ice on the water troughs, and a week of sustained wind that tested the integrity of every structure on the property. Ezekiel worked in that cold with the physical endurance of a man who has been doing hard outdoor work his whole adult life, and Carlos Reyes worked alongside him, and they kept the herd through it with the loss of only 2 animals, which was considerably better than many of their neighbors managed. In the evenings through that cold winter, The house was warm with wood smoke and lamplight, and the particular domestic richness of a full-home Eliza reading or mending at the table, baby Margaret in her cradle near the stove, Clarence constructing elaborate and fragile structures out of sticks that he collected on the porch in inexplicable quantities, and considered a valuable resource. Ezekiel sat in the good chair by the fire that Eliza had found at an estate sale in Laredo, and insisted on hauling home in the back of the wagon. And he read and he watched his family in the warm light, and he thought about the Tuesday evening in the spring of 1878, when he had tied Duchess to the hitching post outside the Broken Spur Saloon with money in his pocket and a deed in his breast pocket, and an invincibility that was about to be comprehensively dismantled. He thought about the long pale road north under the moon, and the amber circle of a lantern over a broken axle, and a woman standing in that amber light with the direct eyes, and the calm assessment of someone who has encountered broken things before, and intends to deal with them. He thought about what he had lost that night and what had come of the losing, and the thought that came was not that the loss had been worth it. The loss was a reckless thing he never should have done, and the lesson of it was genuine and not to be minimized, but that the road home had brought him to exactly where he was meant to go. One evening in March of 1883, with the winter finally breaking and the first tentative warmth coming back to the Texas air, Eliza sat across the table from him with her coffee and looked at him in the way she had, the full attention, the direct eyes, and said, "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her across the table, across the lamplight and the baby sleeping and the small boy dreaming loudly in his room, across the 4 years and the work and the seasons and the whole accumulated life they had built in the house on the Frio County land. "I was thinking," he said, "about how I lost everything in a card game on a Tuesday night in the spring of 1878. She watched him steadily. "And how I rode home in the dark," he said, "with nothing left but a good horse and the particular kind of shame that makes a man look at himself straight, and how I found a broken axle on a moonlit road and a woman with a lantern and very strong opinions about coffee." Eliza's mouth curved. "My opinions about coffee are correct and always have been," she said. "They are," he agreed. "And how," he continued, "everything I have now, everything that actually matters, not the land or the cattle or the horses, though I'm glad enough for all of those, came from that road, came from that loss." He paused. "I don't recommend losing your land at cards as a life strategy. But I can say that the road home on the worst night of my life led me to you, and there is no accounting that makes that anything other than the most fortunate night of my life." Eliza set down her coffee cup. She looked at him with the warm, full, entirely honest look that was the look he knew better than any other face in the world, the look that had said yes before he asked the question in the East Field 4 years ago, and had been saying it every day since in 100 different ways. "Ezekiel," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are the best thing I did not expect," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and through the window the March night was soft and beginning to smell of the coming spring, and in the room above them their son slept, and in the cradle by the stove their daughter breathed steadily in the warm light. They stayed like that at the kitchen table in the lamplight for a long time, in the house on the land he had lost and won back, in the life they had built together from an unexpected beginning on a moonlit road, and it was entirely and irreversibly and specifically the life that was meant for them. Not the easier life, not the comfortable life they might have had by other roads, but the true one, the real one. The one that had required the losing and the road and the broken axle and the woman with the lantern to arrive at, and every piece of it was worth exactly what it had cost. In the years that came after the quiet, full years of a working ranch, and a growing family, and the deep partnership of a marriage between two people who respect each other's minds and trust each other's hearts, Ezekiel Covington would sometimes think about the man he had been on that Tuesday evening in the spring of 1878, the man with the cattle money and the deed, and the invincible certainty that the next hand would surely be the one that turned it around. He thought about him without contempt, because contempt for your past self is a form of ingratitude. That man had built the 80 acres, had done the 3 years of work that made the story possible, had sat down at a card table with 3 strangers, and had the specific and necessary misfortune of losing everything he had, and had walked out of the Broken Spur Saloon at midnight with nothing left but a good horse, and whatever he was made of, and had pointed that horse north because there was nothing else to do, and Duchess had carried him north on a pale road under a spring moon, and there had been a lantern, and there had been Eliza. He still had Duchess. She was an old horse now, speckled gray around the muzzle, turned out in the home pasture where she moved at her own pace and was not required to work unless she felt like it, which was Ezekiel's considered judgment of what a horse of her service and character deserved. Clarence, who was 6 now and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubbornness, and opinions about fence post intervals that he had arrived at independently and defended vigorously, had adopted Duchess as his particular personal horse, which Duchess permitted with the dignified tolerance of an elderly animal who understands that children are temporary, but requires them to behave. Margaret Langley came south twice a year now, in the spring and in the fall, the wagon driven by Carlos Reyes's eldest son, who had taken on that job with the seriousness of a boy who takes his responsibilities seriously. And she stayed for 2 weeks each visit and filled the house with the particular energy of a woman who has a great deal of opinions and the wisdom to know which ones to share. Her health had stabilized with rest and care, and the doctor in Laredo had been cautiously encouraging at her last visit, and she sat on the Frio County porch in the afternoon sun and watched her namesake granddaughter sitting in the dirt and organizing small stones with a deliberateness that Margaret found entirely familiar, and she laughed. In the fall of 1884, Eliza told Ezekiel across the kitchen table a 3rd time, and the feeling that came through him was by now not a surprise but was still, in its full dimension, entirely overwhelming. The same clean, large gratitude. The same specific awe at the accumulated improbability of how a man gets to the place where a 3rd child is on its way in a house he built with his own hands on land. He won back with his own work, alongside a woman who had been worth every card he'd ever lost. Their 2nd son was born in April of 1885, when the bluebonnets were running thick along the creek, and the mockingbirds were at their spring extravagance. They named him William after Ezekiel's own father, who had died in Missouri when Ezekiel was 22, and who had been, like Eliza's uncle Clarence, a stubborn man with strong opinions and a fundamental decency that you recognized most clearly in retrospect. William arrived in the world with none of his brother's fury and none of his sister's watchful calm, but with a sunny, easy disposition that made Mrs. Baxter, who had come for the birth as she had come for all 3, say he was the most agreeable baby she had ever attended. He slept well and ate well, and regarded the world with the cheerful interest of someone who has arrived somewhere they find entirely satisfactory. Clarence inspected him with the same serious assessment he had applied to Margaret and declared him acceptable, which was an upgrade from Margaret's review, Margaret being currently present and within earshot, and looking at her elder brother with the expression that suggested she would be filing this away. The night after William was born, Ezekiel sat on the porch of the Frio County house in the April night with the smell of bluebonnets on the air and a cup of coffee that was, by now, made to exact specifications that had been established in the early months of the marriage and had since become effectively law, and he looked out at the land, the good grass running to the fence line, the windmill turning slow in the night wind, the mesquite beyond the fence dark against the star-heavy sky. He had 3 children. He had a wife who was the best person he had ever known, bar none, in all the ways that mattered. He had land and cattle and a horse operation that was building into something his children would be able to take up after him if they chose. He had a life that was full in all directions. He held his coffee with both hands in the cool night air and breathed it in, all of it, the bluebonnets and the wood smoke and the particular smell of Texas spring, and felt the depth of his gratitude with the full attention he had learned to bring to things that deserved full attention. The door opened behind him and Eliza came out tired, moving carefully in the way of a woman who has just given birth and knows what her body needs, but upright and present, which was characteristic, and settled into the chair beside him with the ease of long practice. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I will in a moment," she said. "I wanted to be out here first." She looked at the night. 3 children, Ezekiel. 3, he agreed. "Do you remember," she said, "what you told me on the Baxter porch the night we met, about what you hoped for?" "I told you I hoped for a wife and children and a life that meant something beyond the work itself," he said. "Yes," she said. She looked at him in the dark, and the stars gave enough light to see the expression on her face, which was the warm, direct, entirely honest expression that had been the one constant beauty in his life for 7 years. "It means something," she said. "This life. It means a very great deal." "It does," he said. "It means everything." She put her hand over his where it rested on the chair arm, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat together on the porch of the house he had built and lost, and won back in the Texas night, with 3 children sleeping inside, and the mesquite rustling beyond the fence and the mockingbirds finally quiet for once, and the stars overhead in their deep, uncountable numbers, and the land spread out around them dark and solid and theirs, and the creek running unseen in the northeast corner, where it had run through 3 years of his solitary work, and 7 years of their shared life, and would run long after both of them were dust, and their children's children had taken up the ground. He thought, this is what home is, not the deed in the breast pocket, not the 80 acres registered in the county land office. Home was this, the weight of her hand in his and the children breathing in the rooms behind them and the night and the stars, and the fact that tomorrow and the day after and all the days after that, she would be here, and they would work and argue about books and talk, until the stars turned and disagree about methods and agree about things that mattered and be entirely, specifically, irreversibly known to each other. He had lost everything in a card game on a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1878. He had ridden home in the dark with a good horse and the clothes on his back and a weight in his chest that felt like the end of something, and the road had given him everything. "I love you," he said to Eliza Langley Covington, there on the porch of the house on the land by the creek in the Texas night. "I love you, Ezekiel Covington," she said, and squeezed his hand. "Now come inside. The coffee can wait." He followed her in, and the door closed on the night and the stars and the Texas spring, and inside the house on the Frio County land, the lamps burned warm and steady, and all 3 children slept, and the life they had built went on.